So if I'm a security leader, thinking about, what's going on in the threat landscape, how can I use all of that understanding to actually help me make better decisions? So we're effectively helping anyone in the security function making, higher quality decisions about where to invest their resources and their time. So the different sort of things we will look at tends to be the first two that we look would keep us really busy. So clearly state threats, so looking at the likes of China, which is very kind of active. Clearly Russia, a lot of conversations about how the Russia-Ukraine invasion might impact Russian cyber operations. Also got the likes of North Korea that's very interested in cryptocurrency right now, so a big challenge for a lot of financial organizations. And then we're also seeing a lot of emerging states, the likes of Vietnam, a great example of a country a few years ago we weren't necessarily talking about from a kind of cyber threat perspective, now actually really develop very meaningful credibility. Cybercrime, clearly ransomware, it's something that we've seen through, say, Colonial Pipeline or the attack on the Irish healthcare service, or we're in Costa Rica more recently. This is something increasingly discussed as a matter of national security. And then hacktivists, those kind of ideologically motivated threats, they kind of disappeared for a long time, but they've had a bit of a resurgence in the last few months. So certainly some interesting things there. But we're tracking all of this. We're doing instant response engagements where we're observing these threats in clients' networks, and then we're trying to take that information, make it available, package it up in a way that's really actionable, really useful. So these are the different types of things that we might consider doing. Again, it's all about improving decision making. That could be kind of high level advice on emerging threat trends, helping executives understand something like ransomware and why it's gone from being a bit of a nuisance, a bit of an IT problem 5 years ago, to something that is now front page of Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, etc. But we might also actually get a bit more technical and focus on, say, specific security controls, detection technologies, etc. So I'll move into a kind of a day in the life, if you like. So as I said at the start, it can really cyber threat intelligence can really encompass a variety of different areas. I think, as I said at the outset, at a high level, we're briefing organizations on developments in the threat landscape and what's likely to target them and what they can do about it. But you can very much take a cyber threat intelligence career in different ways. If you're like me, and I assume some of you would have that kind of international affairs, politics kind of backgrounds, then you might be interested in, say, the geopolitical trends and those high-level issues, the espionage coming out of states. That might be something that gets you really interested in this topic. Other people might be really interested in cybercrime and non-state actors. Some people might just want to reverse engineer malware all day, but I don't really understand what they do in all honesty. So I kind of leave them to it. But the point is that there's a lot of different things that you can do within a cyber threat intelligence career. And you can really choose to try and build expertise in very specific areas if you enjoy that research component in terms of your kind of current studies. So it can touch on a lot of different areas. I think it's also something that can be very rewarding. Some of the most rewarding work I tend to do is actually working with organizations that have experienced network intrusion. So if they've got a ransomware group that's just encrypted all their files, helping them understand who this is, what they can do about it, understand that broader context. When you help them recover from those sorts of situations, it's something that can be very rewarding as a career as well. So the general kind of day-to-day, I guess, for most threat intelligence analysts will be responding to what we would call requests for intelligence, or RFIs. So this might be, if you're like Mandiant, we are a cyber threat intelligence vendor. So clients will come and ask us about these things. But most big organizations will also have an internal threat intelligence function. So there'll be a threat intelligence team at Barclays, HSBC, the Cabinet Office, all of these sorts of areas. And they will go to their internal threat intelligence team as well. So again, it might be something very high level. Will the Russia-Ukraine invasion impact the cyber threats in my sector? What does it mean if I'm a media organization in the UK or in Eastern Europe? What does that mean? What sort of threats do I need to consider? What are the really active ransomware threats right now? How has that threat evolved in the last 6 months? We could also look at different threats like Chinese groups that have been targeting, say, technology sector. But we also do a few other different bits and pieces. So actually, a lot of what we'll be doing is answering stupid questions. So what I mean by that is you might see an executive that's been reading the Metro on the way in the morning, and there's been some really kind of sensational report that's gone out, news article, someone talking about cyber Armageddon, for instance. And actually, a lot of what we'll do is actually guide or executive stakeholders through those sorts of issues and actually say, you probably don't need to worry about this story, but there's this other thing that you do need to worry about or be concerned about. A lot of concern around, say, specific events. So there'll be a lot of conversations right now about threats related to, say, the World Cup, G20, UN summits, all of those sorts of things, absolute hotbed for espionage groups, as well as, say, ransomware. So there's often a heightened response, and organizations want to understand that. So we might work for, say, specific governments that are hosting these sort of events, as well as, say, sponsors of those events that are interested in how the threat landscape might impact them. Might also, say, help organizations when they do see malicious activity or want certain playbooks at a kind of technical level for, I'm really worried about the ransomware strain that impacted all of Costa Rica. What can I do? What sort of security controls can I do to actually stop that? And within that, as I kind of already alluded to, that there are very much different paths. So if you really enjoy your research, then it might be the analyst path. That's very much looking at the threat landscape, kind of very focused, almost like doing a PhD in terms of the way you're very focused on, say, tracking North Korean groups or cybercrime groups, etc. I did that for a couple of years and I really enjoyed it, but I probably found over time that I wanted to have a bit more kind of interaction in my career and kind of get out of that very research focus. So there's also, say, consultants and advisory work. So that's what I do. So a bit more kind of speaking to organizations, speaking to clients, building those relationships, etc. And then part of that is also program development and training. So I also would, for example, train analysts at some of our clients and look at their program as a whole. So if they've got a threat intelligence program in their organization, how do they make that more mature? How do they make sure that they're really utilizing those resources in a really sensible way? As I said, there are also technical pathways, so things like malware analysis, digital forensics, detection engineers, all of those sorts of things. Not really so much my area, and you absolutely don't need to be, really technical to get into the industry, which is something that I think a lot of people from a kind of international affairs, politics, they'll often, the first thing I'll hear is that they're not technical, right? Rather than all the fantastic things that they do bring to a role like that in terms of being able to communicate and synthesize. There's also the kind of external outreach and market-facing side of a lot of CTI roles. So, that might be, I do quite a lot of work, say, speaking to the media. It might also be, for instance, just sitting on panels, doing public speaking, etc. So if that's something that you're kind of interested in doing, or you've enjoyed maybe the presentation side of academia, that's something to definitely consider. And then I've already mentioned the kind of end user threat intelligence functions versus vendors, and different kind of lifestyles there, I guess. By the way, if there are any questions, I'll do questions at the end. If you've got any questions throughout, please do let me know. So the reasons I think you should consider a CTI career is, for me, number one, is that the threat landscape is always changing. So the actual subject matter, I think it's inherently interesting. That might be because I'm a little bit sad, but I do think if you look at something like Russia, Ukraine, right, it's very new. And how's that going to change things? It really is changing things in a very fundamental way, not just in Ukraine, but across Europe and, say, the US as well. So I find that stuff really interesting as a kind of former academic. I think that the subject matter is very interesting. Looking at, say, how cybercrime has developed in the last 18 months, again, something I find interesting. Looking at emerging states is something that's a bit of a pet hobby of mine. So, we talk a lot about China, Russia, North Korea, Iran. We recently put out some reporting on Belarus cyber operations, for instance. So I think in the next few years, we'll have a much more complex picture where a lot more states have now invested in cyber operations, and there's just a lot more activity. So I think that's quite exciting. I think if you're at a threat intelligence company that's also, for example, doing incident response work, that's very interesting in the sense that, we've got some really fantastic visibility. We've done a lot of incident response work in Ukraine over the years, for instance. So we really get a good insight into the threats. I'm not sure how familiar a lot of you are with Mandiant, but we've been very close to the action with things like SolarWinds, where we discovered that by virtue of being compromised ourselves. So this was a kind of supply chain attack from the Russian SVR, the Foreign Intelligence Agency, that went directly after us, as well as a lot of the US government, for instance. And then I think the final thing I would say on the career side is, and this actually is for any career, is I think one of the best ways to look at what you want to do for your career is to look at those trade-offs, right? And it's not always the case, but I think in general, you've got to make some compromise. So if you want to get into, say, investment banking, you might accept that there's going to be some unsociable working hours at times for the promise of really good pay, right? That's a trade-off that a lot of people will make a legitimate trade-off to make. Other people might say they want to work in the charity or third sector, and they might forego those kind of fat salaries because they're really focused on a really kind of important mission and doing meaningful work. When I look at cyber threat intelligence, I think that it is inherently interesting. I personally feel like I'm making a difference in the sense that working with organizations, improving their security, especially on, organizations I'm kind of interested in, government entities, etc. Especially when they, for instance, experience a network intrusion and they've been compromised, etc. You can make, really good money doing this sort of career as well. So that's always going to be a factor. I think compared to some other sectors, cybersecurity, I think in general in tech, you tend to be treated quite well. So that's kind of important as well, I think, for a lot of people. There's a huge amount of vacancies. So if you are ever treated badly, it's pretty easy to jump ship. And I think then, employees kind of understand all of that. So I think when you think of those trade-offs, I think threat intelligence is a really nice blend of all of them. Could you make more money doing certain things? Perhaps, but it's not like you're kind of, you can still make kind of nice money there. Is there a nicer career, lifestyle, working part-time, something? Yeah, perhaps, but I think it's that blend of different trade-offs that I think makes threat intelligence something to really strongly consider. All right, so I want to get into a kind of career workshop, and I think as this is the older version of the slides, it might be slightly out of whack, but we'll just see what happens. So what I want to do is kind of create this kind of scenario where we are building out this kind of central threat intelligence capability, and we're going to go for UK government this time. I think the last time I did something like this, we were it was for a bank, and I thought actually let's make it interesting with everything going on in the world right now and do UK government. So normally you look at, say, UK Gov, the Foreign Office, the Cabinet Office, MOD, they would all have their own threat intelligence functions, with something like the NCSC also acting as a kind of centralized resource as well. We're not going to get into any of that. Let's just say it's a central UK government looking after kind of defense, foreign policy, national strategy, all of the above. And we'll kind of go through a few things. So the first thing we would always do with organizations, if you're building out a threat intelligence function, is you would create what we call a threat profile. So what I think most people would associate a threat intelligence capability is looking at that threat landscape. Who's targeting you? Which sort of threat actors? What would their motivation be? What are their kind of tools, their tradecraft, their modus operandi? But actually that insight in its own it's interesting, but it's very limited in that what we're really interested in is how that intersects with, first of all, the technology and the kind of the stack within an organization. So if UK Gov uses exclusively Apple and MacBooks, etc., then maybe perhaps threat groups that exclusively go after Windows wouldn't be as interesting. But then also what matters for us, right? So if we've got all of this technology and we understand how threats might target that, it's also interesting to think, well, what is it that we really care about? And that's going to change for different organizations. Some organizations are going to be super hot on the kind of keeping that information confidential. So it's going to be about, really, if this sort of information gets out there, it's going to be absolutely disastrous. So if I think of, say, an intelligence agency that's got a lot of human sources, etc., that would be something that's hugely important. For other organizations, it might be, if I take a media organization, it's going to be much more about the availability. It's going to be the running of that network. If people get into Sky or BBC, there's probably some stuff that that those companies wouldn't want to be exposed, but they're probably much more interested in availability and the continuous running of those services. Same for any kind of critical infrastructure, for instance, like energy. So what we're really interested in is the intersection of all of these areas. So if I kind of throw it out to you guys, and we don't have to make this too structured, but if we start off with maybe thinking about the sort of threats that might target the UK government, and obviously there's a lot of different entities that might be interested in UK government, but what do you think would be the kind of the primary threats right now that we'd want to start building out on the understanding of? Yeah.
It's to like economic side or like infrastructure that's quite linked. So
okay.
Like bigger companies like the WannaCry attack and stuff.
Yeah. So if you're talking about that kind of impact on financial, on the economy, etc., what would be the sort of threats that you'd be concerned about there? Would it be Vietnam? Would it be cybercrime? Would it be the kind of hacktivists that, if you look at the different kind of categories of threat groups?
Yeah, cyber attacks more impacting. I'd say the impact would probably be on the economy through the infrastructure breakdown, I'd say, through the attacks.
And then, so do you think that would be a cyber criminals that would be the main thing to consider there, or espionage groups, or what?
Yeah, hacktivists kind of.
Okay. Yeah. So I think with something like that, there'd be a blend. I think if we look at, say, in terms of going after financial organizations, it's really interesting the way that North Korea does that to kind of raise government revenue, which for a lot of people is mad because states have traditionally focused on espionage targets. But yeah, we're also seeing kind of cybercrime going after those sorts of targets, trying to kind of gain money. It's often also a lot of interesting data for espionage groups as well, right, in the financial sector. Can anyone think of any other kind of examples of threats that the UK government might be really concerned about right now?
Could it be Russian threats? I don't know how exactly, but maybe any kind of hacking of any system.
Yeah. So we'll actually get into Russia. That's a really good example. I think right now, if you look at UK Gov, clearly been very active in the Ukraine crisis, and that could actually play out in a variety of different ways. But yeah, certainly have a limited number of friends in Russia right now, and I think that would kind of, we can actually unpack that a little bit in a while. I mean, I guess what other espionage groups? We've got Russia. Would there be any other espionage groups, any other states that might be interested in targeting the UK right now? I'm not sure if there's anyone. Oh, there's a chat.
We'll check it out if you want.
Yeah, that's
okay. You've got access to the chat as well. Okay. Yeah. So if anyone on the chat wants to just throw in, let me just close that. So in the way. Yeah. If anyone in the chat wants to throw in any suggestions, that would also be interesting. I guess maybe another question while we see if anyone's come from the chat. So if we want to start building out understanding of our threat landscape, what sort of data, how would we actually get that threat intelligence? Where does that kind of come from, do you think? If the UK government want to build out visibility in the threats, where would you start looking? If we take, say, Russia or targets to the kind of UK economy and financial organizations, any ideas where you might kind of look for that sort of data and build out that understanding?
I know that previously they track it back to like where it's come from, but
yeah,
physically I don't know how it's done.
Okay.
It's a good question.
So there's a lot of different ways we could do that, right? So I think one way we could actually do is look at victim environments, so previous victims of those incidents, and we could actually say, okay, these have been the last 10 organizations that have been compromised. Let's understand who targeted them and do all of that tracking once we get access to that data. So we could do instant response, build our intelligence off instant response engagements. So
I think it would be useful as well to see how they solve the issues that they face. So if you look at previous companies or organizations that were under threat in any way, you can see how.
Yes, so that is an absolutely excellent suggestion, because what we're doing here isn't just telling people about what to worry about, it's about what they can do about it, right? So that's absolutely excellent. That's the sort of thing any kind of threat analyst should be always striving to do, is providing actionable insight. So what we might want to do is we might want to look at all of those operations that have, say, targeted UK economy, and let's just say UK financial institutions, and we might want to look at the sort of attack techniques they have used and start to build out recommendations and security controls on the back of it. So if we take, for instance, Iranian groups in the past who have targeted the kind of financial sector, they've typically sent malicious messages and attachments via, say, LinkedIn, via social media. The reason they've done that is because obviously you can invest a lot in email detection and email controls, but actually if you've got employees accessing, say, LinkedIn, you can completely bypass all of those controls. So if we accept, if that's kind of a concern, we could actually start populating information about telling organizations to make sure phishing messages via social media, that should be something that absolutely gets baked into their awareness training. They should start thinking about, providing security advice around that sort of issue to their kind of, to their employees, etc. Yeah.
I just ask, how do you collect raw data without infringing on anyone's rights or privacy rights?
It's a really, really interesting question, and kind of glad you asked, because it's something that comes up a lot. I think it really depends on what you're looking at, right? So if you say take an incident response, there's going to be a lot of private data as part of that. You're kind of going through someone's network, etc. I think the answer is to really focus very specifically on the threats themselves, what they're doing. So, as a company, we're obviously there to help on the incident response, the remediation piece. But when it comes to the threat intelligence, we're not saying, they got this sensitive UK government document, etc. We're saying they deployed this malware and they escalated privileges within that network through this attack technique. And this is how they establish persistence. So even if you turn it off your computer, they're going to be there when you get back because they've set up some sort of persistence mechanism. So I think the answer is to just be laser focused on the threat at hand and the kind of attack techniques that they are conducting. Yeah.
Do you have another team that is tracking it back to figure out who's done it, and then you get that information?
So there's the kind of intelligence license. The way it would happen is there's different ways we can collect data. So we've got an incident response team. We've got endpoint telemetry. So if you think of the kind of the stuff that's on any kind of endpoint device, so we can pick up threats that way. We manage effectively security operations for organizations. So we see that. So what we do is take all of that data, and that's very raw. It's not very processed. If we gave that to clients, they wouldn't really understand what was going on. It'd be gobbledygook. We might have teams that would take that and then package it up. So be the threat intelligence analyst to convert information into intelligence, where it's got a clear structure. It's really easy to read. It's got recommendations. All of the sort of thing we're kind of thinking through now. We've also got another team that when we see some threat activity, they will actually take that data, so the malware being used, the different kind of email addresses sending the malware on, etc. And they will actually see if there's anything else we've seen based on those kind of artifacts, if you like. So trying to say, is this linked to any kind of existing activity, etc. Any suggestions from the chat so far?
Yeah.
A shy bunch today.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's kind of you kind of mentioned Russia. Let's actually explore that in a bit more detail. So if we were going to really think about this, what sectors within the UK, or what do we think Russia would be trying to do if they were going to come after the UK with cyber operations right now? What would they be interested in? Who should be concerned about those sorts of operations?
Government and maybe banks.
Yeah. So let's take the government to start with.
Yeah.
Why would Russia target the UK government right now?
Wasn't it during Brexit that the Russian government was blamed for tampering with something, or was that something different time? Am I mistaken? Something like that. So it's happened before, maybe.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that's completely true, but
if we were to tie that back to this, tampering, that might be around tampering in a democratic process, trying to influence the outcome. So that would be kind of one thing. If we take UK government right now, it's obviously doing a lot on Ukraine. What would be the sort of things that the Russian government would want to get us? Yeah.
Someone online saying tried to disrupt arms being supplied to Ukraine.
That's a fantastic answer, right? So one thing they're going to be really interested in now is the logistics of the movement of goods. So any UK companies that are offering logistics support, that would be a really kind of interesting target for Russia.
Also to gather confidential information regarding strategy, negotiation strategies, intelligence regarding conflict, people working for UK government and Russian structures.
So that's fantastic. So we've got two or three examples already. So we've got information gathering. So stealing information that's confidential around UK government strategy, right? Is UK government going to be involved in a new sanction regimes? Are they starting to plan new sanction regimes? What are they thinking from a kind of military perspective? Is there anything going on in the UN? What are the conversations between UK and say EU, America? So all really valuable for Russia, for the Kremlin to start kind of figuring out its response. On this movement supply of goods, yeah, absolutely. Again, really good example. That might be not just information gathering, but also kind of trying to interfere. But
Two
more
suggestions.
Oh, yeah.
Someone suggested military strategies, and the other person said dividing pro-Ukraine support within the government.
Yeah, so that'd be really good. So really good suggestions, and I'll actually circle back to that in a minute. But what we might do in, say, threat intelligence land is start to talk about specific sectors under threat, which we've kind of done already. So one thing we would do is talk about, you know, where is the threat? And we kind of mentioned government, we mentioned maybe some other sectors. And there's one thing to say these sectors face elevated threats, but then I think the other thing we want to do is actually delve into the sort of thing that we're doing now, but is figure out which threats. So there's kind of, you know, if we take Russia, Ukraine right now, for instance, we could kind of talk about three buckets. There's been disruptive cyber attacks, ones that have either been wiper malware to just take networks out, even things that are actually much more destructive and trying to create physical disruption. There's the espionage, the information gathering, and then there's the kind of information operations piece as well. So on the person in the chat that talked about kind of breaking up Ukraine sentiment, that would be very much on the information operations. So we've got a team that actually does that side of things and analyzing information operations. So that's interesting in that it might say specifically go after, say, the media sector, and it might be more interested in, say, how do we get, can we kind of deface Sky News or BBC, or can we get access to some of those journalists? You know, can we get access to Laura Kuenssberg's Twitter account, start putting stuff on there, etc. Where espionage, not so interested in media versus, say, you know, maybe Cabinet Office, Foreign Office, Ministry of Defence, etc. So another way to look at this is on the different Russian intelligence agencies. So we actually track effectively every Russian intelligence agency, and you can see there'll be the likes of the GRU, the SVR, FSB, and then there's the threat groups that we track that are linked to these different intelligence agencies, which has, you know, been a really interesting time. So what I want to do is just try and think about two different Russian intelligence agencies and how they might differ in terms of the type of operations they conduct, the sort of sectors they might go after, their incentives, etc. So if we take the SVR, so this is a foreign intelligence service, so very much kind of traditional, kind of maybe kind of probably unfair, but we compare it kind of to a kind of MI6, CIA type of organization. What would be the sort of things that they might be interested in right now? And some of it might refer back to previous things we've discussed.
Identifying personnel that might be working within the Russian government that are like part of the UK or Western. Yeah.
And I can't remember, I think it might be one of you talked about actually accessing kind of sensitive UK government kind of strategy. Do you think that's something that would be in the kind of SVR wheelhouse? Yeah, because their mandate might go after you know, foreign governments, find intelligence with kind of foreign sources, understand what's going on, etc. You know, provide all of that information to the Kremlin. So in that sense, what would their, if say APT 29, which is linked to the SVR, is in your network, if we get a call from the UK government saying we've seen some evidence that we've got some, you know, APT 29 malware, we think it could be them, what would you immediately assume that APT 29 is going to be trying to do in that network? Yeah. Espionage, yeah. So they're stealing information, right, and exfiltrating that information back to organizations. Yeah, perfect answer. If we compare that to the GRU, so this is a military intelligence agency, it's kind of, we think about it in kind of military terms, the likes of, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with our naming convention, things like APT 28 or Sandworm. What would you think a military intelligence unit might be trying to do? If we forget about UK right now, just in general, what might it be kind of trying to do right now?
Gather information on strategies or disrupt the current approaches taken by the other side.
Yeah, and I think that second piece, so the GRU is absolutely interested in information gathering, but they've probably got more weighting compared to say SVR on that second piece, is the disruption, right? If we look at SVR, they conducted the SolarWinds. I don't know how kind of familiar you all are with SolarWinds, but incredibly stealthy attack, right? They really understood how network defenders operate, and they wanted to make sure that they blended in with that activity. They didn't want to get caught. If you look at the GRU, it wants to disrupt. It wants to disrupt networks and activity, and it doesn't care as much about getting caught. So these threat groups look very different in the way that they operate at that technical level, but that is informed by the geopolitical situation. It's informed by the different incentive structures of different intelligence agencies operating out of Russia, for instance. Let me just go through. So if we look at something like this is very disruptive or destructive activity. And I'll share these slides, by the way, so you don't need to kind of take copious notes on the breakdown. But this was some kind of malware we kind of observed, and you could actually see it was targeting critical infrastructure and energy organizations, trying to disrupt controllers, trying to sabotage industrial processes, remove safety controls, etc. Now, I don't think this has actually been linked to a specific Russian group. I think there's a lot of assumptions it is Russian, but that would be something that would probably fall under that GRU style kind of attack we've seen in the past. And if you look at some of those really disruptive attacks, this is going after energy grids, right? It's going after something like the Winter Olympics, trying to really disrupt things in a very physical way, targeting, say, TV stations and their availability. All of that very much in that kind of GRU military kind of wheelhouse. If we compare that to, say, APT 29, which is, as we've mentioned, linked to the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service. This is very much focused information gathering, very stealthy, very kind of high operational capability. So it can conduct multiple, quite time-intensive operations simultaneously across different time zones. So something more kind of track the different time zones they operate in, for instance. Really get how, say, something like incident response works, going to make it as difficult as possible to detect. With SolarWinds, what they effectively did, so SolarWinds is a technology company. A lot of organizations might use SolarWinds in their networks. I don't know if UCL uses SolarWinds, but they could. They compromised SolarWinds, and they effectively inserted their malware in a legitimate update. So, you kind of see, oh, my SolarWinds have got to update it, except as we all do on our iPhones, but that was where the malware was. So incredibly stealthy, very difficult to detect that sort of thing. And we found out about that firsthand because it compromised us and stole some of our data. And then interestingly, just on the kind of information operation piece, for instance, this was really interesting in that it was a denial of service attack. So, networks being overwhelmed with network traffic. This was something that I think most of us would kind of brush off and say, this is so 2010, right? We've not, this stuff really easy to remediate. It's not particularly exciting. No one really gets too over concerned about DDoS operations. So this went after Ukrainian financial service, Ukrainian banks, for instance. What was interesting, though, from an information operations piece, is it was actually combined with an SMS campaign. So Russian groups would send out these texts to Ukrainian citizens, and it would effectively tell them that bank is offline. So they would go check, they'd see that their banking app isn't working, their banking website's not working. They would start to doubt, or they would, it undermines the integrity of the Ukrainian financial services kind of sector as a whole prior to an invasion. So that is a great example where the cyber piece of this isn't particularly interesting, but it's part of a much broader information operations campaign. It's trying to, the main impact here is psychological rather than kind of anything else. So yeah. And then sorry, were you going to?
No, sorry.
So at a slightly more technical level, what we might do and what we have done for our organisations, and don't worry, I'm not going to go through each of these in turn. But what we might do for organisations that are really worried about Russia right now, if we take, say, UK government or UK financial services or even Ukrainian organisations right now, they might say, I'm really worried about Russia, Ukraine. I want to know, is my security strategy, are all the security controls, all the things I'm actually investing in and maintaining, do they actually map to the Russian threat? So what a threat intelligence team might do is they might look at all of the Russian threats that we've observed as a company, what's being reported elsewhere over, say, the last 2 years, understand the really common attack techniques and the sort of security controls that might actually prevent those attack techniques from being successful. So at a slightly more technical layer, we might give a list of kind of recommendations, security controls. We say to organizations, if you can, make sure that these are part of your security strategy, you're going to be much better off when it comes to, say, Russian groups. You're going to have a really good defense, a really good chance at not only kind of remediating, preventing that, but also detecting it before it's too late. So just to try and give you a flavor of the different types of products that threat intelligence analysts might create. All right, so wanted to move on to kind of career advice. Hopefully that was useful, give you a kind of sense of what we kind of might do when it comes to cybersecurity and threat intelligence, and the sort of kind of advice we might be giving to organizations. I think this is a really exciting career path. I think you should absolutely consider it if this is the sort of thing that you think would be interesting. But I also want to be really honest and upfront about some of the current challenges. And that isn't to discourage anyone. I think absolutely any career that you are thinking of has a gritty reality that they don't mention on the career pamphlets. And actually, we're much better off if we understand that and we can start building a plan. So not trying to discourage anyone, I'm trying to make sure that if this is something that's interesting, that you're prepared. And when it comes to cybersecurity, it's still a relatively young industry. So there aren't necessarily clearly defined career pathways. And if you go to your university career kind of guidance counselor, I bet they have a lot of resources if you want to be a banker or a lawyer. They probably have some resources if you want to be, in cybersecurity. Probably not so many on cyber threat intelligence specifically, right? So that information does exist, but you kind of need to know where to look, and I'm happy to help there if I can be useful. Industry works on relatively short-term hiring cycles. So there's a kind of a theme here where if you're talking about, say, going into consulting more broadly, you might be part of a graduate scheme where you get captured in the autumn for a kind of job the next summer. It's quite reassuring in many ways. You don't necessarily have all of that with cybersecurity. You tend to find that once you're available, you get a bit more success. But there is a flip side to all of this, in that if you wanted to be an accountant or a lawyer, there is a very well-trodden path. And you have to do your 2 years training, get your chartered, accountancy, etc. Nothing wrong with that, but there's a well-trodden path. With cybersecurity, you have huge amounts of agency to actually design your own career, because there aren't those kind of well-trodden pathways. So it's actually much more down to you as an individual to say, I want to be the person that really focuses on China, or I want to be the person that's speaking to that cyber policy. You have a lot of agency to actually shape that career in a way that suits you directly, both in terms of the jobs you apply for, but even when you're in a job to actually kind of build that out and define that, etc. So there are some challenges. A lot of the jobs might require a few years experience, which is kind of similar with a lot of industries, and this kind of weird paradox. But there are some things to be really excited about, and that is that it is a massively growing market. I think it's going to be as recession-proof as you can kind of get right now. Things really improve. So when I joined, which really wasn't actually that long ago, there were very few career vacancies at that entry-level role. I'm really impressed with just how quickly that's changing. Huge demand, really exciting time. This is a growing industry. Huge amounts of growth still to go. There is a little bit of uncertainty based on some of the above, but I've spoken to so many people that were having these kind of challenges, and then a few months later they've found that first job. So it's not to say that you can't do it, and you absolutely can.
Sorry, can I ask?
Yeah.
It says 2 to 3 years experience. In what sector exactly? How can you get in to get the experience and get the job?
Well, that's kind of the point. Is it's this experience paradox, and you do find that with a lot of industries, right? That they just say we need this experience. I think I'll talk a little bit about how you could get into the industry. It's one of those things that I think, if there's not a graduate scheme in the sort of thing you want to do, like say you wanted to go into a cyber policy role, right? That is something where I don't know if any organization does a kind of cyber policy entry-level role, right? It's something that you kind of have to build yourself. So it's an interesting challenge, but it's not one that, there's a bit of a hurdle there, but it's not one that can't be overcome. So what I would say to that point is, I think you need to be really open-minded and actually kind of embrace that journey, if that's not kind of too cheesy a thing to say. I came out of Oxford and I was just hyper ambitious. I kind of wanted to either work for, you know, Foreign Office, Google, or, you know, a very small number of groups, even Mandiant, and that just didn't work out that way. I couldn't get into Mandiant first time around, which is kind of one of the top CTI providers. I had to go and do a different job first, and then I was able to move into Mandiant. So that is just a reality. But I don't know if it's probably not particularly reassuring, but the way retirement ages are heading, you'll probably be working for at least 5 decades. And I think if any of you are like me, you put huge amounts of pressure on that first role. You know, it's this kind of, you've got to have this dream job, you've got to land at somewhere like Google or Foreign Office, whatever that might be for you, from day one. And we put huge amounts of pressure on that first role. And I actually think the first decade is about making mistakes. It's about trying things out. You know, in my mind, it's kind of everyone was going to land in that kind of grad scheme, and you know, by the time they're 25, they've kind of figured life out, and it just doesn't work that way. So I think be really open-minded and actually be open to actually building a career with a kind of 5-year plan. Because if you just focus on that first year and you're turning down opportunities because they're not exactly what you want, I think the much more interesting question for any of you to ask is, where does that first role take you? You know, what career capital do I build along the way? Great example in cybersecurity. There's a lot of people who choose a government career to start with. They might not necessarily get paid as much as they would want, but the experience in government is hugely valued. It's really valuable in the private sector. So you can actually make a lot more money by doing something really strategic at the start that makes sense. So one thing you might want to do is do what I did, which is go for a smaller threat intelligence function. They typically have a culture of hiring new talent and training them up. You might want to just get into cyber. You might say, I'm not fussy, I just want to get into cybersecurity, and then I'll pivot into threat intelligence later. Or you might want to do intelligence. You might want to go work for an intelligence agency or a political risk organization, a political risk consultancy, and say, actually, there's going to be all this work about, you know, market entry into China and, you know, those sorts of issues that those companies will do. I'm going to try and do the technology and the kind of cybery type, you know, questions that we get, and kind of try and build this brand as the kind of cyber person in one of those organizations. I actually think a lot of this applies to any career path, especially one that's not kind of well defined. Yeah, so I think, as I said, try and take as much ownership as you can. I saw a lot of people coming out of my PhD program get really frustrated with the fact that they couldn't just kind of swoon into the career they're choosing. And, you know, why aren't PhDs valued more in the kind of, you know, in the industry? And I get all of that. I found that frustrating, but actually kind of ruining that too much doesn't stop the fact that that does exist. And you're much better off saying, well, what can I do to overcome that? I think having that idea of designing your own career, having a lot of agency, and it being your job to kind of manage and build that out, to thinking about where you want to be in 5 years' time, how you can build the relevant experience. I think people that have that view of kind of designing their own career have much more kind of exciting careers, regardless. If you're getting into cybersecurity, having that asset basically, it's great to understand what you need to work on if you're not technical, the sort of skills that you might need to build. But the amount of people that just say straight out, I'm not technical, and that's kind of becomes their identity. It becomes this kind of Achilles heel for them. I think that, you know, the sort of courses you're all doing, your ability to synthesize information, your ability to communicate, your ability to write well, your ability to identify strategic issues and understand the bigger picture, all of that incredibly useful in cybersecurity, as well as other kind of technical or technology-based organizations. I think the other thing to say is that people actually really want to help. When I was getting into the industry, I just spoke to a lot of people who've had careers I kind of really looked up to. Get as many mentors as you can. I think try and do that with a degree of authenticity. So maybe not send the same message to just a load of people you find on LinkedIn, but actually kind of look into what they've been doing, etc. I really enjoy kind of helping people. So if anyone's interested in that, please do reach out. And then all I would say is if you are someone that benefits from that, is just to kind of pay it forward. You know, people help me. I've not bought them any kind of wine or said thank you kind of over and over again. What I do is I make sure, you know, to really kind of try and help the next generation as my way of saying thank you. And yeah, be ambitious, which is all right. And then I think finally, I would kind of break down, if you are really serious about threat intelligence specifically, there's kind of 3 different kind of buckets. There's baseline knowledge, understanding the threat landscape, and then somehow showing you're passionate, which we'll get into. I won't go into all of these in too much detail, but baseline knowledge is things like understanding of how to write intelligence products, which is a bit different to say an essay. It's maybe an understanding of, say, security and network fundamentals. some of the frameworks used in threat intelligence. Again, I'll share all of this, the slides of this, if that's something of interest. I wouldn't go into any certifications straight away, like Network Plus and Security Plus. That's probably overkill. But these might just be some of the sort of things just to understand, what is cyber threat intelligence? What is intelligence? How would I write an intelligence report? How is that different to a kind of, an essay, for instance? So that'd be number one. The second is actually understanding the threat landscape. So understanding what's been going on in the news, what's being reported, what's going on in Russia, Ukraine. What are those latest developments? Again, got some suggestions in terms of podcasts, in terms of kind of industry news sites. I think CyberWire, it's a daily email. That's just a great summary of what's going on. The challenge then is to actually read it. I'm certainly guilty of signing up to newsletters and then just never reading them. There is a wealth of insight on the kind of infosec/threat intelligence Twitter community, but I always would say take that with a pinch of salt, because there's a lot of memes and stuff that's perhaps good fun, but not particularly educational as well. But so that can be a bit of a double-edged sword. But some good ideas there, hopefully, in terms of how to just understand what's going on in the cyber threat landscape. Now, there's a big question of how you showcase passion. How do you show you're really engaged with this topic? A lot of people say you've got to be passionate. I don't really like that as advice, because I think what you probably care about more is how you get hired and how you show that in a really practical way. What I think is one of the best things to do, or two things. I think number one is to focus on one really specific part of the threat landscape and build out some understanding and some research on that. So you could be really interested in the role of contractors, the role that the private sector is playing in helping states conduct cyber operations. Or you could be really interested in Russia, Ukraine, or it could be cybercrime, it could be Vietnam, etc. If there's one area you can really focus on, and maybe even build out a little mini report, but even if you don't do that, just have a kind of really confident understanding of one group. That means you go into that interview and you probably know more about that very specific thing than the person interviewing you. Because I'm looking at all of this stuff all the time. I don't really have time to really zero in on one threat group. That would be one recommendation. The other would be just to start building out some online presence, which is something that's quite valuable or valued in the kind of hiring process. SecJuice is a blog that will just allow you to write whatever you want, and they will publish it to the extent that there's not all these rounds of review. If you wanted to put something on the Council on Foreign Relations, or some of these other blogs where there's a lot of reviews, it's quite frustrating. They might not necessarily be, they might not like your idea. I get rejected all the time when I want to write this sort of stuff. If you want to if you've got an essay that you've done as part of your studies on cyber and you just want to get it online, something so you can point to, so I'm really engaged, I'm putting this stuff out there, then it's not quite a copy-paste job, but you might want to kind of change it so it's looks like it's a blog, but that's a really good kind of way to do it. I've got some additional resources, just kind of reading lists. I'll leave these up, but I'll also share the slides. But please do take a screenshot if any of that is useful in the short term. And with that, happy to take any questions. I'm not sure if anything's come up in the chat.
Anything in the chat?
Yeah.
Do you ever feel like the CTI field, in the CTI field, that the government or the company that you worked for, they not only asked for defense, but they also asked for offense from you, meaning like targeting certain countries or targeting, not doing something like moral?
No, I mean, to be honest, not really. We might work with governments that would be thinking about conducting proactive operations, right? So if we look at the different clients, I've talked mostly about network defenders, helping UK government stay secure. If you're maybe a law enforcement agency, you might be interested in threat intelligence, not only to defend your own networks, but to understand cyber criminals and use that information to conduct proactive operations. But we can't do that. As fun as I'm sure it would be for us to conduct cyber operations against the bad guys, I think we'd end up in jail pretty quickly if we tried any of that. So there's not too much of that directly, but we might work with organizations that have that capability. When it comes to that, we're really clear on, obviously a lot of countries that we wouldn't work with on that sort of thing. There are some countries we just don't operate in at all, but so we're very careful to do anything that would spill out, but in general, no, we're mostly working with, say, network defenders. Thanks very much. I think it's a great time to be thinking about all of this. So yeah, appreciate you listening.
Thank you so much.